Okay, everybody, so you have gotten yourselves ready to start this process of learning about yoga. And actually, ultimately, the first question is, what is yoga? Um, I mean, you might have seen different types of practices and different people looking in different ways, and all of them are associated with yoga, but then they're all different from each other. And so, what is yoga? Well, first, let me say that yoga is both the state of consciousness that is ultimately the goal, which they call enlightenment, or they call illumination, or they can call it samadhi or satori, or different number of languages. So, yoga is the state of that enlightened state, which is really a state of being in the present moment, as well as it is the practices that lead us to that state. So yoga is actually two things. It's actually the state of consciousness itself, and it is the series of practices that lead you to that state. Now, as we're beginning our process of what is yoga, um, I will just kind of be sharing with you what is yoga for us in the Western world, as we would go to any yoga class that we might find in a yoga studio, or a yoga class that you might find online on the Lima Yoga Life platform. So let's talk about what is yoga in that context. And in that context, yoga is a series of practices that are operating on different dimensions, that are all guiding us to an ability to see the world differently. Okay, an ability to see the world differently. What does that mean? That means that in one way we're operating in our previous or our daily life, and we're having thoughts, and those thoughts are, maybe they have frequencies of fear, or they could be relating to jealousy, or they could be related to anger, or and that's something that we have all experienced, I think. And so the question is, how can we go from that, anger, fear, jealousy, and those kinds of energies of the mind, and then how do we, instead of that, do we experience compassion, and do we experience unconditional love, and how do we experience peace and well-being, and different other, what we call higher states of consciousness. Okay, so that's a terminology that I'll be using a lot, and I'll be talking about states of consciousness, and that's an important thing as we introduce what is yoga, because the different practices of yoga, of which there are breathing exercises, that's called pranayama, there are physical exercises, that's called asana, and then there are practices of meditation, are all designed to help us go from the level of consciousness which is lower, which is really not in our best interest, which is actually making us less healthy and less well, because of that which we call psychoneuroimmunology. This is the relationship between your thoughts, your emotions, and your immune system. And so instead of letting our thoughts and our emotions create a physiological environment that's less and less healthy because we're not aware, these yoga practices are giving us the ability to transcend and experience these higher states of consciousness, which are unconditional love, compassion, surrender, forgiveness, and up into even the more spiritual dimensions of self-realization. That's what yoga really is. It's a series of practices. I call them technologies, really. Technologies that are getting handed down to us from the gurus and the masters to give us an ability to see the world differently. And why we want to see the world differently is because a lot of times when we're not using our awareness, our mind is going back and forth from the past and the future, and the past and the future, and the past and the future. And the thing about that is that creates an overall feeling of suffering, because the past doesn't exist and we experience it as regret. And the future doesn't exist and then we experience that as fear. And so we're really just going back and forth between those two kinds of energies, and their separate manifestations. But we're not often here in the present moment. We're not often here feeling the grace of divinity or the grace of God, we could call it. And so these practices of yoga, which are multidimensional, are designed to give us that opportunity to experience these higher states of consciousness, which is to say more peace, more well-being in our life. Now, before we move on, it's very important to understand that when we talk about what is yoga, all of what I've just said is actually built upon a foundation of a principle, of several principles, really, 10 principles, really. But just to keep it simple, we'll talk about just the first one, the bedrock, the one that all of it stands on. And you don't have to really incorporate what I'm going to say right now, like anytime soon. But because this is a course on yoga and I must be complete about it, I'm going to mention this. Okay, maybe some of you will already have understood this before in your life. Either way, that yoga is all built upon a foundation that's called ahimsa, and ahimsa means don't cause pain or violence or injury or don't kill other beings. And so there is a relationship between that principle, okay, and yoga. Okay, now, like I said, maybe in 10 years from now, maybe you'll incorporate that. Maybe not. I'm not here in this beginner's course to tell you that, you're going to have to eat one way or another way. You'll eat however you want. But fact of the matter is that if you want to experience more and more of the benefits of yoga that we're about to talk about, and you like the benefits that we're about to talk about, and you want to experience them more and more, then they do come faster and more powerfully when you incorporate the food aspect of this relationship to ahimsa. And that means less animal foods, less killing, less chickens, less goats, less fish, less cows, less any other animal that you like to eat, less of that stuff. More fruit, more fruit, more fruit, and more fruit. More smoothies, more juices, more things. Vegetables are fine, of course, too. Salads are great. More fruit, more fruit, more fruit. Less cheese, less milk, less all that stuff. And that's what we could call the yogic diet. Okay? And that's really the foundation of everything. Because how you eat is going to determine your physical health, it's going to determine your mind, it's going to determine your spiritual capacity, and all this stuff is connected. And I know this is just the very first talk here in what is an introduction to yoga. And I appreciate that nobody is coming to a beginner's course in yoga who has ever even thought about the idea of eating less meat. That I understand that. And I thank you guys for being here with me, to have just, your patience to have listened to that for the last 5 minutes. And like I said, maybe in a year or 10 years, or maybe never, you will start to eat less of what I'm asking you to eat less of, and more of what I'm suggesting that you eat more of, and maybe not. But at the end of the day, it is part of yoga, and so I wanted to mention it, okay? So that's what yoga is, a series of practices designed to help us change the way we are seeing the world, and so that we can experience more peace. Great. In the next chapter here, we're going to talk about the benefits of yoga.